leave it on the entire time or turn it off trip. And green means you're live.
Okay.
Just that the green light goes on. And you know, you just hit it once and the green light goes on and we're all set to go. And we're going to start right this second.
And where do you want us to sit? Okay.
I'll show you. So, Steve, we have you sitting over here.
So you can point this anywhere in the room.
So we're getting the new version up on the screen.
Okay, that sounds good.
So if you sit here, and Melanie will be next to you, and Michelle. I think Melanie, Michelle said you guys together. Oh, Bob, very. So, and you know, you press this once, and the green is on. And we have you sitting right here next to Steve. So she said 20 minutes or so.
Oh, hang on. I'll put this in. Yeah, okay.
Grab all these papers. Anybody have any last minute questions? Ooh, not.
Everything is good. Thank you. I'm just holding mine in my lap. It's UNA sponsor today. Yes. It's all picture. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Welcome everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you all so much for coming out on a winter afternoon to talk about Goal 16 and how we measure peace. It's a real honor at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. I'm Melanie Greenberg. To be co-sponsoring this event with our host, the Stimson Center, and also the UN Association, who all have a very deep interest in the subject that we're talking about today. And although Richard will formally introduce Steve Killelea and Michelle Breslauer, I want to say just what an honor it is to be on the stage with three of my peacebuilding heroes and such close partners. So thank you. So this subject is especially dear to my heart. I think it was Tip O'Neill who said that all politics are local, and I would argue that all data is political. And it was a great victory for the peacebuilding community to get Goal 16 into the 2030 agenda and to make sure that everyone knows that peace is an integral part of development. But it also raised a tremendous challenge for us, because if you look at the other 17 goals, they all have decades of experience in how to measure their impact. When I was a program director at the Hewlett Foundation in the early 2000s, when we were up against the environment, education, public health, they all knew how to measure success. And at that time, we really didn't have a way to measure peace. But in the 15 or 16 years since then, Steve Killelea and his team at the Institute for Economics and Peace have really helped us say, well, how do you actually measure this? And not only to measure the absence of violence, or to understand which countries are more or less peaceful, but actually, how do you measure positive peace and all the different streams that have to come together to have a just, peaceful, and inclusive society? So where we are right now with the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a lot of angst around Goal 16 and how we measure the results. Not only from member states and their statistical bureaus about what kinds of data to gather, but also citizens who are defining peace very differently on the ground sometimes than their governments do at the statistical level. And then often those kinds of citizen-level indicators that talk about perceptions of government, perceptions of safety, are very threatening to their governments. So this is not only a question of developing good metrics, but understanding the politics of data. And then as Goal 16 and the Agenda 2030 moves forward, member states are saying, well, can we just be selective about which goals we choose to implement? And within each goal, can we be selective about the data we want to gather? So in our discussion today, we'll talk about groundbreaking work that the Institute for Economics and Peace has done in actually measuring Goal 16 in a progress report, and then open the floor for a really rich discussion with all of you. Richard.
So on behalf of Stimson, and as well, I'm wearing another hat, the UNA National Capital Area, the local chapter of the United Nations Association. Welcome once again here to Stimson today. So great to be partnering with Melanie and her colleagues at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And we're really delighted to have Steve and Michelle back here in Washington to, in a sense, I heard it's one of the first times, so you're getting a special treat today, one of the first public forums to discuss their latest report, the SDG Progress Report, which hopefully you've all picked up a copy on your way in today's discussion. But it's a comprehensive global audit of progress on available SDG16 indicators, the indicators that help us to track the progress along the 10 different target areas of Goal 16 that I think many of you are quite proficient in. And in addition to the Goal 16 discussion, a closely related initiative and what the Institute for Economics and Peace has really made a name for itself over the last decade. First of all, congratulations then on the 10 years of the Global Peace Index that most of you are quite familiar with in this room. Celebrated its 10th year last year in 2017. And then we'll also hear some the connection to this really important concept we all know about in the literature on peacebuilding, positive peace, and they've done yet another remarkable set of diagnostic work on measuring this multi-dimensional rich concept of positive peace, very germane to what we know as the Goal 16 and something closely related this year, the Sustaining Peace Agenda. And yeah, on that note, we were going to have friends from UNA tell you a little bit about upcoming programming activity in general. You can get information on the way out with this documentation, and we would really encourage you to consider joining the local chapter of UNA because we're doing great work on all the SDGs through a Sustainable Development Committee, human rights, environment, yet another important SDG, I think 13 on climate. But in our Peace and Security Committee, which is one of the co-chairs of today's program, besides, well, in connection with teaming up with Melanie and her colleagues last month on sustaining peace and experts dialogue that was held at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, we're hoping to host, along with our colleagues at the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Peacebuilding Support Office Assistant Secretary General to give an overview of what you're all going to be hearing about in the next few weeks, the Sustaining Peace Report of the Secretary General, followed by a high-level meeting in the UN General Assembly in April. So these are some of the activities coming up this spring that we want to get you involved in. And one last personal note before I introduce our main event and special guests, Steve and Michelle, today. There's details on a peace consolidation benchmarking handbook by the United Nations. This was one of the last projects I was intimately involved in the Peacebuilding Support Office a few years ago. Mike Jijic, who's here in the front row, was actively involved in advising that initiative from his work at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Some of you might remember the M-Peace framework from the USIP in recent years. But just to say that this issue of measuring the progress of UN peace operations, peacebuilding, the Peacebuilding Commission countries, it's been around for some time, but with today's discussion on Goal 16, we're really raising our game as a peace community and diagnosing and measuring progress on fundamental issues at national and local levels. So with that said, we're really delighted once again to hear from Michelle and Steve, who after their overview presentation will engage in questions and answers that you may have, but we want to have, of course, a conversation and hear your thoughts on this important issues. And I know Steve told me earlier that in addition to the report, he'll give some of his general thoughts about the Agenda 2030 and this goal, this important Goal 16 that we're looking at today. Steve, as most of you know now, is the founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP. And after successfully building 2 international software companies from his native Australia, he's really committed his life to work on sustainable development and peace, with the IEP being one of his most important initiatives. Steve's colleague to my right, Michelle Breslauer, represents IEP's programs in the Americas. She works with a diverse group of stakeholders to build profile and partnerships for IEP. She's a graduate of the London School of Economics, her master's work there, and also in New York had worked for the 9/11 Memorial Museum at the World Trade Center and many international humanitarian initiatives over the years. So we're delighted once again. Over to you. I think Michelle is going to kick things off.
Thank you. Just turn myself on. Thanks to everybody for coming out. I'm just going to welcome you on behalf of IEP before turning it over to Steve to present really the meat of what we're talking about today, which has to do with data and how does the data that we have and can analyze inform our understanding and our actions. And from the sort of outreach perspective of being based in New York City, working closely with the United Nations, being extremely involved in the discussions towards the adoption of Goal 16 and then the resolution around sustaining peace, I'm here to also offer a bit of perspective around how we're communicating some of these issues to a wider audience and using them also for these advocacy efforts. And I've been really heartened to see the uptake not only of peace and sustainable development language, but really the interrelationships between Goal 16 and other goals and between different agencies at the UN, so that when we're talking about development now, the work that we are doing, the language of positive peace and investing in prevention, the economic benefits of reductions in violence, we see that reflected everywhere now in the work at the United Nations and even in the rhetoric around this goal. And I think that's been a really great marker of how important it is to put evidence behind a lot of the things that we're talking about. So I'm really happy that you're out here today and happy to answer any questions from that end as well, but I'll hand it over to Steve for the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you for the various comments, Richard, Melanie, and Michelle. Now, this is the first time I've given this presentation. In fact, this presentation's so fresh, we just finished it 1 minute before coming up here. So, bear with me if it's not quite as polished as normal. What I'm going to do is move through 3 sections in it. One, I'm just going to come back with the very, very high-level results, which we've got from the SDG16 report. I'm then going to fall down into a positive piece and now look at that as a holistic framework for being able to look at peace, and then come down and fall down to where, let's say, the areas we're going to have to watch, or some of the Achilles heels with Goal 16. So that'll be the format for the presentation. So, just a little bit of background on the Institute for Economics and Peace. So, we've got a global media reach, our 2 major products, the Global Peace Index, Global Terrorism Index, in the last 12 months have had over 3 billion media impressions. We've now got offices in 4 different countries around the world and setting up in a 5th. So we're headquartered in Sydney, Australia. We've got the office, the Americas, which is run by Michelle, based in New York, offices in Mexico City, The Hague, and we're currently in the process of considering setting up in The Hague. We've got a direct digital media reach of 10 million, but if we start to look at now, let's say just the Twitter impressions, and we look at the extended reach, we're up to 180 million Twitter impressions in the last 6 months alone, so the information gets round. Do a lot of work. We work extensively for the UN, OECD, World Bank, Commonwealth Secretariat, United Nations, and we also perform contract research for all those groups as well. And we're ranked as the 15th most impactful think tank in the world based on size. And for a think tank which is about 7 years old, I think that's an excellent effort. Now, if we go back, we had the Millennium Development Goals, and I've just listed the 8 of them up here. And it's interesting when you just look and compare the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you'll note in this, there's no mention of peace. Now, this is a little bit dark, so it's very, very hard to see. If we come back and we just look at the first goal in the Sustainable Development Goals, the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger. What happens? That now turns into the first 2 goals, which we've got associated with the Sustainable Development Goal. When we get down to goals like 13, 14 and 15, we're really getting out into very, very big and broad subjects, like the sustainability of the planet, climate change and other such things. So the breadth of the Sustainable Development Goals is truly, truly breathtaking. But with that comes back to, it's very, very large, but how do you actually know where to target and what to focus on? So obviously Goal 16 for us is the important one. So Goal 16 in many other ways is the enabler for many, many of the other ones to happen. So if you want to, so let's say corruption within Goal 16, lower levels of corruption affect nearly every other one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And all in all, there's 169 targets with 230 different indicators, and that's a lot, So the question comes back, how can a government really focus on that? I was in Germany maybe, I think it was about 9 months ago, and speaking with the statistical office there. And the statistical office don't think they're capable in Germany of covering the 230 goals. So how are you going to go into Rwanda, Uganda or Tanzania? Very, very much harder. So there needs to be a focus and somehow coming in on what are the most important goals. They will vary from country to country, but us as independent observers really do need to start to have a voice focusing around what do we think is important. So now let's move into Goal 16. So what our Goal 16 report covers, there's 23 indicators in SDG16. Where our report covers 22 of those indicators, and Richard said there's a report outside. I really suggest everyone go and get it. That report is a shortened report of what we've got online. So we've got also an online report where you can go into and you can extract the measures for each of the 163 countries and independent territories covered in the report online. So we haven't put all of that in the report because the report would be about that thick. So, but what we can say, there is enough information to actually measure progress for most countries towards SDG 16. So now, if we look at it, 8 of the 22 indicators have less than a 50% coverage of countries. So that's a lot to be done. Only 7 of the 22 indicators have data for more than 90% of the country. So that gives you the bounds within which most of it is. So it gives you an idea of just how big the gap is in what we need to get really comprehensive reporting. Indicators like violence against children, sexual violence and underreporting of violence are comparable for less than 40% of the countries. And they're ones and indicators which everyone in this room would consider important. So let's just have a look at a few of the key findings. So 15% of businesses state they need to have a bribe to engage with public officials. And this would include just attending a meeting. They have to bribe the officials to turn up at the meeting. 72% of countries have seen a fall in homicides over the last decade, which is true progress. Only 34 of the countries actually have recorded conflict in 2016. So as we look into that, so that gives the other, that you take that away from the 163 countries. And although conflict is a subject we talk about a lot, it's not pertinent to most countries. And a conflict is counted as more than 25 battlefield deaths. 21 of the 34 countries in Africa recorded a fall in violent crime in the last decade. So you can see from that, Africa has actually got really quite a positive trend going on. The vast majority of countries recorded more than 60% of households actually perpetuating violence against children. So we're going to come back and we're going to think about violence. We really need to come and think about the family unit and the acceptance of violence within that family unit. That's both male violence perpetuated against, let's say, female partners, but also against violence perpetuated by both the mothers and fathers, just in a disciplinary process on the children. Because if violence is acceptable as a disciplinary process on the children, those people grow up to think that it's an acceptable way of disciplining other people. In Africa, only 40% of violent incidents are recorded to the police, and this comes back to the whole issue of corruption. Now, if we look at Europe, which is other than 2 countries in Europe, everyone's feeling more harassed than what they were a decade ago. So now in producing this report, what we've done is we've gone back to 2005, come through to 2016 to be able to give trends on how the various countries are performing. What we didn't do was turn this into an index. The reason we didn't turn it into an index because the measures within Goal 16 aren't conceptually sound. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing to do, because measuring something is not better than measuring nothing. But it started with a political process, and a political process of negotiation. When we look at it, it's a combination of what we call negative peace, which is just measures of violence or fear of violence, positive peace, which are the things which go about actually creating a peaceful society. In other words, also a resilient society. So from that angle, we decided to not create an index. Rather, what we do is we look at each individual country, the progression of that country, but then we can also look at individual indicators and see how they have progressed globally as well. So in the last one on this is 19 countries have birth registration rates of less than 50%. So if you didn't have a registration here in the US, you wouldn't actually exist, would you? So just being able to get these basic things in is just really, really important. So what we've found, if we take just really quick summarisation of all of this, we've got data availability for 60% of the indicators averaged out by countries which are covered. There's a concept of indicator performance, and that's where we give a ranking of the good, moderate, bad. So very, very, very simple rating. And what we'd say is the performance on those indicators which are covered is 94% would say is good. Now it's an arbitrary number. I'm not going to come up with the details of each of them here, but that's in the report, and it's highly debatable on what considers good or bad, and I'll let you all have that debate after you've read the report. In fact, you can come back and debate it with Michelle, because I'll be gone. So now, the other thing too is we're looking at the indicator trends. And so as we look at the indicator trends, 33% of the countries over the decade have improved on the measures for Goal 16. Roughly a third have fallen, and roughly a third have stayed the same. So it's a bit of a mixture. So the next decade will be very, very interesting to see how performance goes. Now, what I'd like to do first up is just focus on a few economic factors. So what is the cost of violence to the global economy? And this is another piece of work which comes out of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Our calculations are $14.3 trillion in 2016, and that equates to about 12.6% of world GDP, or about $2,000 for every person living on the planet. And that's truly a staggering cost. In fact, I believe this is really quite conservative, these estimates, and the real estimates of maybe 50%, could even be as far as 100% higher, because we can only count what we can count. And there's a lot of things which we know we'd like to count, but we just can't get the accurate stats for. So now, what I want you to think about, if we could just decrease the cost of violence globally by 10%, that'd be $1.4 trillion to the global economy. And that's a lot of money. That's an awful lot of money. So what does that actually mean? How can you compare it to some facts which we know? So 1% reduction in the cost of violence is equivalent to the total amount of overseas development aid in 2016. So no one here in this room finds it beyond their imagination to reduce the cost of violence to the global economy by 1%. But if we did that, that'd be the equivalent of the overseas development assistance. So now we went for something a little bit more audacious, but still something which is really quite achievable. Go for a 10% reduction in the cost of violence. And that's the size of all foreign direct investment in 2016. And another way of doing it, it's like adding a new country, another economy to the world, which is the equivalent of the total economies of Denmark, Switzerland, and Belgium, which are countries we all know. So SDG16 is vital in terms of freeing up trapped capacity within the global economy, which then can be fueled back in to cover the cost of the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals, because the challenge is being able to fund those ambitious goals. Now, if we have a look, just a breakup of where the cost of violence is globally, we'll find military expenditure is the biggest. Next is followed by internal security, followed by homicide. So, a much more peaceful world means reductions in military budgets and internal security, which then flow on to investments into other more productive areas. So now, just to give you an idea of the effect of violence on our economies, so we did the study for the World Tourist Association on terrorism and the effects of terrorism on tourism. And so what we did is we took two countries which were developed and two countries which were developing, which had very, very similar tourist economies. So the first was France and Italy. The tax in France meant the tourist industry there dropped by about $2 billion. And then the same year, Italy's tourist revenues went up $5 billion, almost $7 billion difference. We then looked at the developing world to see if the pattern was the same. And we picked Tunisia and Morocco, very similar tourist industries there. And again, we can see there's almost $2 billion in difference in those industries from that period. So now I'm just going to come around and talk a little bit about the Global Peace Index, and I'm going to come around and talk about positive peace, and then I'm going to come back into the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Global Peace Index consists of three different domains. The first is ongoing conflict, which we've got 6 measures on. The second is the social safety and security, which has got 10 measures. And the third is militarisation, which has 7 measures. So all these come together to form a holistic measure to capture negative peace, which is reflected in the Global Peace Index. Now, having the Global Peace Index, which covers 163 countries and about 99.7% of the world population, it gives us by 23 different dimensions, gives us a really solid statistical base to understand what actually creates and sustains peaceful society. So we do a whole lot of statistical analysis. From that, we derive the concept called positive peace, which I know many of you are already familiar with and has had a strong history in peace and conflict studies. We can take that then and turn it into a positive peace index, which now means we can measure countries according to the likelihood of being able to sustain peace in the future. And that can be used as a measure of resilience. So we come back around now and we start to look at positive peace. You can describe it in many ways as it creates an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. Because not only does it create peace, it creates a whole lot of other things which we think are important for societies, including high levels of per capita income, more resilient societies, ones which perform better on ecological outcomes, and ones which have higher GDP growth per annum. And so positive peace consists of an architecture of 8 different pillars, and sort of well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relationships with neighbours, high levels of capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and sound business environment. And they come together as a system. They all interlock and function together. You can't say one creates the causes of another. And if you just think about something like, let's say, corruption, government, and free flow of information. Now, does corruption impede the free flow of information? Does the free flow of information improve the functioning of government, or does the functioning of government affect the levels of corruption, or does the levels of corruption affect the government? You can't pull any of it apart. It's what is called a mutual feedback loop, which I'll come to. And also, if we went back and studied the Millennium Development Goals, positive peace was strongly correlated with better performance on the Millennium Development Goals. So in theory, it should be too for the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look at positive peace and we go back over the last 20 years, what we find, countries which are high in positive peace compared to countries which are low in positive peace, on average, had about 2% higher GDP growth rate per annum. And that is really, really substantial. And there's a lot of things which can flow from that which I haven't got time for in this presentation. If we come back and we look at civil resistance campaigns, it's one way of being able to measure the resilience of a society and its adaptability. Countries which are high in positive peace have far, far less civil resistance campaigns. They're more moderate in their goals. They last for less amount of time, more likely to achieve their goals, and are far, far, far less violent. If we come back now and we start to look at internal shocks, and so positive peace is a good measure of resilience. We find that genocides do not occur in countries which are high in positive peace, nor are there violent conflict which overthrows the system in countries which are high in positive peace, and very, very few political shocks. And again, you can see how this comes back to things which we matter. So what I want to do is just come back and think about a system, because this comes back and is very, very important for the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals, as we've said, came about through negotiations. So they're not systemic themselves in nature. They're very, very good things to aim for. But it's like cause and effect, okay? We want to lower poverty. Here's the things we have to do to lower poverty. And these are very, very good actions in their own. But if we look at societies, they function more as systems. And so if we think about the super systems which we've got, these would be things like the ecosystem, the biosphere, you can see climate change caught up into it. And a subsystem in part of that is really the international community. And within the international community, then you have nations. And then within the nations, you have other subsystems, such as business, it might be the education system, policing system, or even the family. And so by taking a systems perspective on the way the nation state operates, you can now start to build in, through similar frameworks, understand the ecosystems upon which we depend and develop. So the studying of the nation from the concept of systems is really, I think, going to be a profound breakthrough. None of this stuff is simple. So what I want you to think about is just a couple of very, very simple concepts, like one's encoded norms and intent. So now, if you think about yourselves here, all of you would realise that you're more than the sum of your parts, okay? Because you're conscious, you're thinking, and you're taking what I'm in. Dissecting you down to any level, I'm not going to find your consciousness, because it's more than the sum of the parts. And that's one of the fundamental things with systems. When looking at a causal approach, what you always do is you break things down to ever and ever smaller sections so you can understand the ways they work. A bit like a clock. You can pull it apart and put it back together again. You can't do that with a system. So there's a concept of mutual feedback loops. And as I'm talking to you, I'm actually changing your consciousness with the words you're saying. But as you look at me, that actually affects what I'm going to say back to you. So we're all engaged in these mutual feedback loops. Think of two political parties forever sparring and always changing what they're doing because of the interactions of the others. And that's the basis of systems. It's not cause and effect, because the effect will always be the same from the cause. So we've got a system. You have inputs which come into the system. They hit encoded norms. Those encoded norms determine then how the system reacts to an input. If it's out of range, the system will make a response. That will then go back and affect the input. So think of the rising inflation. The central bank takes a response, which goes back and affects the input, which was rising inflation. Think about an outbreak of crime. Think about an outbreak of an infectious disease. You'll find the same kind of things happen. But if there's disease, it's not out of the normal, that's not going to change the health system, is it? So now, so we're moving, and so what this leads to is tipping points, and this gets very, very important when we're thinking about individual countries and sustainable development goals and what actually depict. So if we start to look at this, we've got various tipping points. So if you look at peace and corruption, and this comes back to SDG16 and the corruption indicator. So corruption can increase, doesn't have much effect on peace till you get to a certain point, after which it passes a tipping point. Very small increases in corruption have large effects on peace. Similarly, if you look at peace and GDP and per capita income, you see the same thing. Once you get past a certain level of peace, per capita income really goes through the roof. So now let's come back and we'll hit back to the SDGs. So what we'll do is now we'll take the framework for positive peace, which you can see has been empirically derived and acts as a holistic framework. It's got a philosophy around it, which comes back to the way systems focus. So let's now analyse all the SDGs. What you'll notice, out of the 169 targets, there's only 3 measures for corruption. 1 directly, 2 indirectly, and they're all in goal SDG16. So if you come back to any of the goals in the Sustainable Development Goals, corruption's got to be a key in terms of being able to affect it. Now, come round to free flow of information. So if we look at globally after the last decade, free flow of information in many ways is on the decrease. And that is epitomised by a free press. So, only 25 measures which affect that. But that would come down to be measuring things like mobile subscription rates and other such things. There's not enough in the Sustainable Development Goals on the free flow of information. And again, if we come back and we look at all the Sustainable Development Goals, having a free flow of information around them is key. Just even simple, if we're coming back and looking at the Better Business Environment Goal under the SDGs. Free flow of information means you can actually price a transaction. So if I want to buy something from you, I've got the information out there to find out how reputable your company is and the comparative pricing of it. As you start to shrink back on the information, it gets harder and harder and harder to be able to price a transaction correctly. So I think as we're looking at the SDGs, we do have to come back, and this is our framework, and there are other frameworks, that we need to compare it back to these other frameworks to understand where is it strong and where is it weak. So we just come back here, this relationship between SDG 16, the economic cost and the levels of violence show a really strong statistical relationship. So again, it comes back to SDG 16. If you get it right, it really shows it frees up so much more money, which then goes back to actually get being able to be there to be able to actually achieve the other SDG goals. So now let's come back and have a quick look at the targets. So what we've got as you move through the report, you're going to find something there for each of the individual targets, okay, at a high level. Just in a bang, it comes back to data availability, indicator performance, indicator trends. And so if we look at just SDG 16, this is the kind of information you'll get out of the report. So for homicides, intentional homicides, 100% data availability coverage. The performance, we'd rate 60% of the countries as being good. And the indicator trend, as I mentioned in the very opening remarks, 72% of the countries globally are improving in it. And we look at the ones with the best countries with the best score are Singapore, Japan, Indonesia, which might surprise a lot of people, Austria and Bahrain. The other end are the countries we all know very, very well, like El Salvador and Honduras. Now, we'll just look at one of the other indicators, and we'll just look at the safe. How do people feel safe walking alone? So the ones at the top, Qatar, Singapore, Norway, United Arab Emirates, and Switzerland. At the bottom end, you've got Venezuela, Syria, Afghanistan, Gabon, and El Salvador. And probably none of that comes as much of a surprise. So what I'm going to do now is just next couple of slides, I'm just going to show you one of the problems which comes up with the reporting. So what one has to do is really look at this data and really understand it well. So now if we look at here, satisfaction with public service, you've got Tajikistan at the top. What I want you to focus on is Kyrgyzstan, which is number 3, or the Kyrgyz Republic. So it's number 3 in terms of their satisfaction with public services. And so if we look at the bottom, none of that, all of that sort of fairly much makes sense. So now I'm going to shift to the next one. It's the government's corruption of business. Note that the Kyrgyz Republic, or Kyrgyzstan, is the second from the bottom. So what I want you to think about is satisfaction with public services, but business rates government corruption is one of the worst. There's real contradiction in terms. Similarly, if we look at the 5 best on the corruption, we'll note that Israel's number 3. Yet we know, and this is business with government, yet we know there's at least 3 really serious investigations going on in corruption within government, within Israel as well. So what it shows is that one of the issues with looking at all of this, and this is going to be reflected right through all the Sustainable Development Goals, the devil is in the detail, and one really needs to get into it and understand it clearly. And this is where third parties can come in and play an active role, because the governments are the ones who are going to be officially reporting on themselves. So the 169 targets, I'll just throw these up, I'm a little bit ahead of myself. So with governments being able to pick what they're going to measure, and we know from the example with Germany, who haven't got the capabilities to cover it all, they're going to cherry pick. What do they cherry pick? The ones which know they're going to get good results at, or the ones which they can manipulate the data for to look the best in many, many, many cases. Not all governments, many governments will report accurately, but in many cases that will be the case. And again, the third parties and NGOs, the ability to be able to hold a light up to try and show what should be important and what should be focused and targeted on within each of these goals. Data availability and the capacity. Now, we look at the German example again, and we come back to training the national statistical officers. Absolutely imperative if we're going to actually be able to get the competencies in many of these countries to accurately report on what they're doing. So that's really, really important. The last one, and this is why I had the slide in there on the monetary cost, and if you can actually get SDG16 working, you're now freeing up money in a lot of these countries where the SDGs are most important. That frees resources to fund it. So as we're sitting here today, we all know that most countries are pulling back on their level of overseas development aid. So there's less money in that pot going forward than what there was for the Millennium Development Goals. If we start to look at the large global charities, many of them have peaked in terms of the amount of money they're raising and flowing back into the development world through the various projects and everything they're doing. So one of the key things as we get to a much more ambitious set of goals, like the 169 targets, funding is going to be one of the really key issues. And again, that comes back to focus. So again, organisations like yourself, it's imperative that for any particular country which you're interested in, understand which are the goals which are really, really important. And finally, this comes back to organisations like ourselves, having independent ability to be able to verify what the countries are reporting on is be really, really key. And that will be the focus of our SDG reports going forward into the future. And that, my friends, is the end of one presentation. That wasn't too bad, seeing it was the first time I'd done it.
Impressive. Michelle, did you want to reflect before we open things up? Good. Richard, did you want to ask that
Sure,
first question?
and we'll have a microphone going around for those who have questions. I guess I'll kick things off, and thank you once again, Steve and Michelle. The world premiere presentation. We have people watching via live stream as well, so this is really exciting to have this opportunity. Not only is a breakthrough in some ways in the whole field of peace metrics, but as you note, independent third-party verification. It's so important that this set of tools is being developed vis-a-vis this important goal, for some of us, our favorite goal within the 17-goal Agenda 2030 framework. My understanding of the SDGs, though, the rubber hits the road in the area of implementation, what we all want to see, realization of its strong both aspirations and very specific commitments when you get down to the targets. It's the national action plans. So to what extent have you started engaging governments, those doing national action plans, that's rich and poor, big and small countries around the world? How can they utilize this as well as the complementary efforts at the global level? I think many of us in this room are quite supportive and gave inputs to the Pathways for Peace roadmap for peaceful, inclusive, and just societies. And then there's another framework, also multi-stakeholder nature on reporting, the Global Alliance on Goal 16. So how do these relate? And then this last issue that you had in your slide about data and capacity, what can international NGOs, some of them represented in this room today, and international agencies, UN system, the World Bank here in town, do to support governments on these critical capacity, especially data shortcoming gaps that are essential to making this report more effective as a tool to understand how we're doing?
Okay, Richard, it's a lot there to talk to. So what I might do is I'm just going to make a very quick response. Then we might get Melanie to make some comments and Michelle to make some comments too. So what I'd say is we cover 163 independent 163 countries and independent territories. That's about 99.7% of the world's population. And so we've got the progress and the level of coverage for each of those countries inside our report. So I'd suggest that each of those countries review that and also see their progress over the last decade on what measures they actually have got data for. And they can use that as the basis now to start to be able to look at the light down the path of where they need to have most focus. So I'll stop there, and you might like to comment on the NGOs and you on the veracity of the data.
Well, yeah, and I just wanted to add, in terms of a lot of these global processes and other initiatives, sitting in New York, we are involved in them, and there's only a few organizations that are really trying to look at the measurement side of Goal 16. If outside of that, it's really national governments or specific initiatives at the regional level. And so, for instance, the Global Alliance for Reporting Progress on Goal 16 is focusing on different regions and different national action plans, but they don't have that ability to take this broad overview. So the work we're doing is this type of reference tool that can be used by these initiatives to look at these broad measures of progress. And I think what we can see from comparing these different data sources, the available data, is one, we see where there are gaps in data. Two, we see where there are conflicting issues, like Steve pointed out, in terms of the political nature of a lot of these indicators. And 3, we can really start to understand different sets of information, I think, by comparing what's out there. And that's where I think IEP is quite strong, is that we're bringing together as much data as possible and seeing what we can understand from that. And I'll give you an example also from the work we do in Mexico, for instance, which is a Mexico Peace Index program. It's related to domestic issues and domestic policies within the country. But through a grant that we received, we started measuring Goal 16 at the subnational level in one of the states in Mexico. And I think this is one of the first attempts to do that. And I have to say, with the civil society organizations that we worked with and with the state government that we worked with, this was not on their radar at all. I mean, I don't think they even knew what Goal 16 was, 1 year ago. But it was an international foundation that's now weaving Goal 16 into their work that wanted to see this measurement. And so what did we find out? We found out also that all of this data that we're already bringing together to measure both levels of peace and positive peace within that state are highly related to a lot of the Goal 16 measures. So we had the capacity to quite easily look at strengths and weaknesses within cities and within this one state in Mexico. We also found out that this is a great tool to leverage for lots of organizations to come together and understand their interrelationships. So it gives us another tool to leverage to say, everybody who's working in development, peace, security, these issues that can seem disparate sometimes, their work actually links up. And when you do this broader measure, you can see where it links up, how people are involved, and where we see general progress. And I think that Goal 16 now and the Sustainable Development Goals are increasingly being used as a way to convene different sectors of society and allow civil society to speak to each other and also to interact more with government. So I think there is a real opportunity there as well to look at those relationships and to leverage the concepts behind this, even if the exact measurement isn't there.
Yeah, I would really second that, Michelle, and thank you for raising that idea of almost a scaffolding that's starting to come up around Goal 16. We're really at an extraordinary international moment. If you look at the new World Bank UN report on conflict prevention that's coming out, at private sector initiatives around Goal 16. In New York in September, a whole group of corporations and law firms came together with ministers, foreign ministers and finance ministers of different countries speaking. It still sometimes feels a little bit like a Tower of Babel, because the private sector ways that we talk about peace could look really different for people coming from more of an NGO development perspective. But I think we're getting there, and it's through this kind of careful comparison of concepts, looking for the gaps, understanding the differences between at the ground level understanding and these more global understandings, they're going to get there.
And can I add one thing? And it's really for your opinion, Melanie, and yours, Richard, who've been in this field for a long time now. Is Goal 16 something that you think has brought the peacebuilding community closer together? Because I feel like even between New York and DC, there's more areas of overlap now as well with groups in those spaces.
Absolutely. And I think that just the advocacy process of really having to come together across all of our different silos, and not just our community, but the justice community, the R2P community, and say, what is the bottom line? What can we all agree on? Was an extraordinary exercise that has continued. So I would say yes.
And I'll add 2 brief points thanks to Melanie's leadership, where there's actually a New York peacebuilding group, and they've been dialoguing with this group that met last month that I mentioned at the outset on the sustaining peace agenda. So there's a lot of talk on the Acela corridor, so to speak. On the goal, it's not just important that we're breaking down silos in our own community, but remember, Goal 16, it was absent from the Millennium Development Goals. It's a huge step forward, And part of the credit goes, there were a number of actors that got it onto the radar and pushed it across the finish line, but it was the international dialogue on state building and peace building and the New Deal that many of you also contributed to that really got us going, especially on these metric tools, which again, the Institute for Economics and Peace has done pioneering work and contributed. So we've come a long way, and now it's really important that we not only work on this goal and measure its progress, but then see it as a foundational goal in relation to the other 16 SDGs. I think Bob had it.
Bob, yes.
I'm Bob Berg, and I have a foot in each camp, a tripedal. And I just want to, as chair of the Alliance, I just want to say, Steve, this is a major contribution among major contributions that IEP has given. Really personally and organizationally grateful for it. It's excellent stuff. I don't want to change it, but I'd like to suggest adding to it.
Excellent. Always up for positive suggestions.
Here's what
Bob.
got us all turned on. Homie Karas and the High Level Commission wrote a report. And what they said in that is that in the field of peace, there ought to be institutional capability in all countries by 2030. That was the thrust of what they talked about. So that countries, and they didn't say there's a blueprint. I mean, yes, here we have USIP, and we have aid and state, and we have civil society. But still, we don't have peace as the first item that the White House thinks about every morning. So, quite the contrary, I'll ask. But it was a beautiful concept. And we all worked hard on it. Our organizations worked very hard to get it. And then in the back room on the indicators, we're missing it a little bit. We have an institutional benchmark in human rights, but not in peace building. And in fact, I would maintain, and I think others in our field might as well, that the future of the international solidarity on peace building is to foster institutions in all countries that make the case for peace building and work on it. And the lack of that now means that there is no great international focus on the health of civil society, kind of the bedrock currently around the world, which is just as endangered as open media is now. There's country after country legislating against civil society, and our field gets hurt in that too. So what I'm hoping happens somehow, and you're the logical source of this, that there be an augmented indicator that would help us to track what's happening to the institutional capabilities to build peace in the world, and lets us focus on where there's dangers, where there's regression, where there's hope, where there's good positive cases now, and where there isn't. And I think that would be a huge service, and if it can't be done by IEP, you're creative enough to say, well, how can it be done? So thanks for listening.
So I'm going to make two comments, Bob. I think that's an excellent idea. There's certainly measures of civil society engagement, which are done from a number of different angles, but not, I think, about the capabilities for peace building within countries. So I think I think there's a lot in that. Now, I'll pose a philosophical question. Now, if we look at the countries which should have the strongest peace building capabilities, and it's built, let's say it's enshrined within the government as let's say Ministry of Peace. Would they be strongest in the most peaceful countries because they don't need it the most, or strongest in the most worst countries because they need it the most? So there's a methodological question in that about actually comparing the rankings of countries. But on all, on some, it's a great idea. So I'll give it some thought. But the first thought is how do you work out what is the appropriate level for a country? So because what they need in Sweden might be one thing, what they need in Sierra Leone's another, or the US another. Yeah. But there's
do the first order, and then we'll get to the second.
So let's go here Peter and then Ed, but then I wonder if Dara, can I embarrass you, give you a couple of questions to think. But as a representative of the U.S. government agency that works closely with Goal 16, maybe give us your read on the data. But let's have two questions first. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. You had the mic. So you, and then Ed. Okay.
Oh, thanks. I guess it's hard to see. I was curious as to why.
If you introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Rachel Carrillo. I'm just an SDG freak. Yeah. But especially 7, 11, 12, and 13. Goal 5 seems to be way out of my reach. Anyway, I am curious as to why Burma didn't show up on any of the indicators, if it's because they haven't been collecting data long enough, especially given what's happened in recent years with their changes in democratization, but also with the Rohingya, who I used to work alongside back in 2000. Thanks.
Yeah. First, so let's cluster
I have a
couple.
follow-on
Okay.
to that. My name is Madeline. I'm with the Stimson Center, and I was going to ask about what you foresee falling through the cracks in measuring this at the country level. You talked about measuring subnational threats or subnational trends, but transnational trends, things that happen at the borders, things that happen at the peripheries that might not show up on if you're looking at things at the country level, which perhaps is true of the Rohingya in terms of just the spatial geography of the situation compared to the rest of the country. So how do you stop things falling through those cracks when you're measuring things geographically?
Why don't we go take those two and then Ed?
Okay, well, I first go, or do you two want to have a go, or how do you want to do it?
Go for it.
Okay, so I think the first one from Myanmar, Myanmar's a country I get to a lot. I've been going there now maybe about 20 years. I've been averaging there once a year. I was up in Rakhine about 9 months ago, just after Medicine Sans Frontières just got kicked out, reviewing the situation up there through my family foundation. So I think the answer, I am only thinking, the answer for Myanmar comes round to the old government just didn't worry about collecting any of those statistics, okay? And so I can remember one of the things we've been engaged in there was this great monk provided free education down in Mandalay for 10,000 kids. So when the US put in the monetary sanctions on Burma or Myanmar, we used to have to arrange for people to fly down to Singapore with a suitcase which they'd fill up with money and then bring back in to Myanmar to pay for the school, to fund the school, okay? And so just looking back on all of that, and you've probably got similar stories and experiences, the government just never had the capacity or the tax base or probably even the inclination to count a lot of the statistics which they needed. Now, they would have had fairly good statistics on things like mortality rates, child mortality rates, coverage of water and some of the other things, but I think when you get down to the more sophisticated ones, they're not there. And certainly if we're starting to look at what's happening in the very remotest parts of the world, particularly along the borders, so you take the border, let's say, between Tanzania and the DRC, which I know well, there's very, very little capacity out there even to be able to count child mortality. I can remember going into what they call a hospital there, which would be building the size of this stage. And then up on the wall would be these charts which the doctor had handwritten with the various stats. And then because the water runs through the hospital, you can see how the charts are just getting covered in water and the ink's running. So the ability to be able to capture the statistics is very, very hard. So I think what's really needed is to be able to really focus on the things which you can do and the things which are instrumental, and then it'll vary from country to country, and this is for the third-party organisations to clearly understand where the gaps are, which are important, and focus on them. So we come back to a concept of systems thinking, and this is profoundly important, profoundly important. So all systems are on a path. It's a bit like me and you. We're on this path. You're moving through the journey of our lives, which is set up by the education we've had and the jobs we have and the age we're at. Can't reverse our age, can we? Although I know me and Bob have been trying. Now, so that's called path dependency. So all nations are on path dependent. So trying to take a statistical office, which have got very, very basic capabilities, and giving it the same a level of competency as Germany, it's not going to happen. You're going to break the whole thing. So it's a matter of sort of nudging the system in the right direction. So if we're bringing that back into the statistical capacity, you look at the areas which are most important. What are things which you are capable of doing? Because they capture the statistics on any of these that flows right down through the nation, right down through the nation. So that'd be the best advice I'd have there. Now, if we're looking at things which were missing, and I didn't put it in the presentation here, but Michelle and myself discussed it. So if we start looking at sexual violence against children, for girls, there's something like 34 countries which have got stuff aggregated down to the level which we want. For boys, evidently it's 4. Yeah. So now, and that's getting it aggregated down to the level which the goal says it should be. So that one surprised me, and I didn't put it up because I didn't really believe it. Okay, it could be that low, but that'd be one which would be worth looking into.
Thank you, Ed.
Thanks. I'm Ed Elmendorf from the UN Association, formerly with the UN and the World Bank. In a forum on peace, I have a double-barreled question. Barrel one, about the United States and the U.S. engagement. Under the former regime, the U.S. was very deeply engaged. My sense is that the U.S. has disengaged, not only politically, but also technically. There was a lot of work that was done by U.S. statistical officials and so forth in earlier stages. I'd like to know whether any of that can continue, what can be done to increase the U.S. official engagement in this dialogue. My second barrel explores further what Michelle was talking about, the subnational level. And I'd like to encourage all of you and all of us in this room to think more in these terms. I have a dream myself, the SDGs in DC. Why not? There's an NGO I know in DC which is exploring the feasibility and appropriateness of using the SDGs for advocacy on some local issues, but I have no idea whether this is going to go anywhere. I just wanted to put it out there and encourage more thought in this. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Ed. I wonder, Dara, could this be your moment to talk about where the U.S. is now?
Hi, I'm Dara Katz. I'm from USAID, and Kristen Cordell is also from USAID and may chime in. I think I wouldn't want to necessarily think the U.S. is still present, and there's a very lively discussion around a lot of these issues, and so inside and outside the government. And so I think that this data, going back to the original flag from Melanie, I think this data is really helpful in the context of these conversations, because it also helps. One of the things that struck me as it was being explained was it really helps put a finer point on the impact of conflict and violence and the positiveness of peace, whereas a lot of the data that has been discussed and that we use in the day-to-day conversations is predictive or diagnostic. And so, and how do you make, and one of the things that we are constantly coming up against is getting traction on the prevention side. How do we actually get policy and budget and attention in a very dynamic world in the prevention conversation? And so I think this is one of the powers of the data that's being presented, and how it cross-hatches with a lot of bread and butter issues that people can also relate to and see themselves in their work in. So I think that that's important as well. I think one of the interesting things is it also raises the question of how do we actually talk about violence? Because particularly in the peace and security conversation and the conflict prevention conversation, while there are hints of family and home and domestic violence, is really still very much at the internal subnational armed groups or international space. And so how is this really taking us down to this tertiary level to really look down at the communities? And I think that's interesting because that engages a lot of different tools and a lot more effective metrics and bought into methodologies. And so I think that is quite useful as well. But I also think the presentation and the way the data is presented also exposes this weakness of data. There's a hunger for data. When we talk to policymakers and legislators and decision makers and program designers, we all want to design effective programs and know that they're working, and to highlight where some of those weaknesses are, and that it puts into relief as well that we really do need to start investing in this side. I think that's been a conversation for a while, but I think it helps put it into relief, particularly here, but that also you can actually find measures. You can have a conversation. And the Pathways to Peace was very good, very helpful on that, of trying to monetize some of the costs, the cost savings and the investment returns to give people that hook. So I don't know, Kristen, if you want to add anything.
Very well stated. I think that covers a lot. And I would just add, to put a point on Dara's comments and sort of circle back on your question, I guess speaking in my own personal capacity, there is an interest in this administration to really improve burden sharing, especially in multilateral systems. And I think when you collect all this data and you can really look at the gaps in a really purposeful and specific way, you can identify where different donors or different multilateral actors can be the most impactful, and then you can have a burden sharing conversation that's very substantive, because you can go to the heart of, okay, if we need A and B to equal getting to goal 16, I'll take A, this other donor take B, let's focus where we're the most impactful, and let's look at how to get to an aggregate on our objectives around SDG16. But I appreciate your comments, and it's very well taken. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that part of the culture in the peace building field that we're trying to instigate is that sharing. And that in order to aggregate and cooperate, you actually have to share. And sometimes that means sharing sensitive information. So how do we do that? Thank you very much. And Maren.
I could add
yes,
quickly
go ahead,
also,
Jill.
there's just a very specific comment to your call for Goal 16 in the district. I think it's through Sustainable Development Solutions Network, but they're running a program with maybe 3 or 4 U.S. cities. I know San Jose is one, maybe Baltimore is another, around the sustainable development goals, integrating them with the municipal political system. I've found that in most of those types of conversations, whether it's that initiative or global ones, Goal 16 tends to be the weakest. Maybe it's one of the harder ones, particularly down at the local level. I mean, corruption and all of those issues. But that would be an initiative to try to encourage the local district to get involved in and see then, for this community, how to push the peace side of it so that it's stronger and doesn't get kind of lost with the other easier to achieve goals.
But ironically, at a local level, it's issues like corruption that actually have traction in a way that sometimes peace doesn't, or homicides. So maybe this is actually a bit of an entree for Goal 16. Now, Maren.
Maren O'Brien and Belv Hussein with Search for Common Ground. And it's great to hear that looking at the veracity of the data is something that's a priority for you all going ahead. I was wondering if you did any data quality assessments on the current data, and looking at how to balance emphasis on data quality versus whether looking at trends across data over time is sufficient to really answer some of the big questions that we have.
So we didn't, for this report, we didn't look at the quality of the data. We looked at the various targets. Then we went out and found the best quality data source we could find to use to actually as the proxy for measuring the goals when there wasn't an official set of figures provided. So that was the approach we took. The belief around assessing the quality of the data would come back to techniques like what I just pointed out on the board up there, where you've got these contradictions in scores across different indicators where they should be collinear to some degree. So I think there's statistical methods you can work out so you can do that, but we didn't do it in this report.
We have a colleague here from the Peace and Security Funders Group, and I wonder if I can put you on the spot a little bit, that from the perspective of private donors, are you seeing traction about aligning programs or supporting data development or anything that's kind of relevant to this piece of the Goal 16 conversation?
I will say that funders are having lots of conversations about monitoring and evaluation within their own foundations and how their funding is having an impact. I think there is some interest to pursue SDG16, seeing where the gaps are, but we've also heard a lot of conversation about working with public-private partnerships and how they might come alongside in ways that the government is potentially pulling back or where funding is dropping. So I think, yeah, there is. Is that helpful?
That's very helpful. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. That's actually Mike and then Ursula.
Yes, good evening. Mike Jagits. I teach in the George Mason University Peacekeeping Master's Program. I was struck by the leitmotif in your presentation being corruption. I don't know whether that was intentional on your part, but it struck me in particular because in my own work, criminalized power structures to me are one of the greatest sources of conflict and biggest obstacles to sustainable peace. So I was particularly interested in your comment about how the states measure themselves. They're the ones who evaluate whether they're corrupt or not. So that raises to me an obvious veracity question. So my question has to do with the relationship between, because one of the 8 measures in the Global Peace Index is corruption. Yeah. So the relationship between your measures, specifically of corruption, and the measures that the states are making of their own level of corruption. Are you measuring the same thing? Apparently not, because they get to decide how they're going to measure it. So that's part of, but will the Global Peace Index serve as a check on false reporting by states on what I consider to be both corruption and then the positive piece, part of that, accountability? So how are you going to approach, if you will, truth-telling by states in their own self-evaluation?
Now look, that's a really good point. And like for me, corruption is one of those. It's one of those pivotal things. Because it just everything else. There's so many other things which spring from it, like just down to getting an adequate health service, even if you're going to tackle poverty, hunger. Yeah, it's all tied in together. So when we're looking at the Positive Peace Index, two of the measures we use for the low levels of corruption pillar, one's Transparency International's measure, and the other's the World Bank. Okay, so it's a combination of the two. So now you might find that different governments may pick one or the other of those measures and use them. And then others may modify, may pick some other form of measure. So one of the ways one can do it is if you take, let's say, the corruption indicators by the various countries and what they've got. Now you see how they come back and compare to those two other indexes. When you get something out by more than a particular quantum, then you know that it's out of range and you flag it. So that'd be another way of tackling the data quality issue.
Okay, and Ursula, you have the last word or the last question.
Thank you, I guess. So I'm Ursula Knutson-Latta with Safer World and the SDG16 Data Initiative, which you should all check out at sdg16.org, where we track globally available data sets for SDG16 indicators, as well as a couple complementary ones that we've identified. And my question is, there's been a big push to support governments by creating national level indicators that touch on the core problem that the target is trying to address, for example, corruption, but is an easier lift for their NSOs. Unfortunately, this then creates lots of issues where it's a patchwork of data that's not comparable between countries. So I was just wondering your thoughts on sort of encouraging governments to follow the indicators so we can have globally comparable data, or whether encouraging more of the national level indicators that might be achievable for a country, but don't necessarily help the global community track.
So my take on that is, look, there's nothing we can do about it because the Sustainable Development Goals, the guidelines of that are set up by the UN. The UN, and because of the lobbying for the various countries, the countries want to have control over the way they report on themselves, and so we can talk as much as we like, that's the state of affairs. And so that comes back to third-party independent verification and data quality, which these two speakers brought up. And I think as we move through into the future, that's going to be key. But that's going to be that'll be contentious with many countries, and will get attacked.
And I think also if you think about Transparency International or another group like that, so they have provided this pulse around corruption since they started their index and their barometer and their surveys. And so there can be two separate things happening. Like Steve's saying, the countries will report their official data that they need to the UN. Third-party sources can keep that pulse and that pressure looking at other factors. And it doesn't have to be necessarily what's accepted internationally. It might be something of influence, it might be something of awareness, and it might be a lot of, in my mind, wasted energy trying to switch the official framework that's going to be politically negotiated anyways.
On that note, any final comments, Steve, Michelle, Richard?
I thought there'd been an excellent set of questions. I think we've covered a lot of ground. And you had about 3 things I was going to close with, but I think each of those things have been thumped hard. I think one is the veracity of the data. Okay, how much can you trust it, and the role of the important role third parties have in the future in terms of going forward. I think the second thing is, although we've now focused on the limitations of the initiative, it's certainly an improvement on no initiative at all, and on that score, so this is the whole initiative is to be applauded. I think one of the breakthroughs for the initiatives came about. So originally, the problem is that peace was considered the absence of conflict, and so what that meant was that not many countries really wanted to have an outside voice coming in and digging into their internal conflicts. And so we can name dozens of countries like that, Russia, China, or even the US. And that's why it never got legs. But part of the outcome of the work we've done by reframing peace as being the absence of violence meant that now you could start to look at things which all countries would agree they want, like decreased homicide rates, decreased violent crime rates, etc. And so I think that change of lens, which we're seeing come in to the SDG16, is incredibly significant and important as we move forward. I think it's quite profound. Even though there are shortcomings in it, it's much, much better than having nothing. And sort of my background, I say this one a lot. So the only reason the Global Peace Index came about, I was looking at some of my projects out of my family foundation. I'm walking northeast Kivu in the Congo, and I started to think, what are the most peaceful nations in the world? Anything to learn from them. Searched the internet, couldn't find anything, and that's how the Global Peace Index was born. If you can't measure something, you can't really understand it. If you can't measure it, you don't know whether your actions are helping or hindering you in achieving your goals. Therefore, SDG16 is an improvement on what was there. Admittedly flawed.
I'll leave it with that.
Nothing substantively to add, but did you want to do thank yous first? And then I certainly want to thank a few folks.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being here, for such an engaging conversation, to each and every one of you for supporting Goal 16, because just looking around the room, I've seen your hand in all of this, and especially to thank Steve and Michelle for sharing your wisdom with us, and of course, Richard, to you and the UN Association again for wonderful partnership.
Absolutely, and also to echo and thank Steve and Michelle. I hope you felt it was as enjoyable and fruitful discussion as we certainly did. We're honored to be here as the kickoff, but in a first public forum to discuss this latest great initiative of the Institute for Economics and Peace. And just from those comments in the last round, from Ursula and the Safer World Data Initiative on SDG 16, I hope you're already familiar with that group, but Mike's work over the years on peace metrics really has been pioneering and inspired us at the UN over the years. And maybe you don't know this, but Bob Berg started the first evaluation office at USAID. So lots of expertise here that will hopefully be part of your peer support community as you go forward with this important initiative. And to once again thank Alliance for Peacebuilding, the UNA chapter. Don't forget to get your card on the way out to learn more about how you can become a member of our local UNA chapter. And we look forward to welcoming you back to Stimson again soon. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Sorry?